Okay, we shall begin then. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Impact in Action number 5. So just a bit of housekeeping to begin with. We are broadcasting this live on YouTube. There is a Q&A function. If you have any questions throughout, please do use that, and we'll answer those at the end. And of course, do get in touch if you wish to present a future session. So just briefly, a bit of background on what this is. So this is the 5th in a series we call Impact in Action. It examines various applications of real-world impact and some of the progress organisations and individuals are making towards the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. So my name is Alex Smith, a Senior Marketing Strategist here at Vertigo Ventures, VV, and Attract Impact. I'm delighted to be joined by Merrick Thompson, who is Project Manager at Cholderton Estate, our subject today. This is an exciting first for us. It's the first in this series to be delivered by a speaker outside of academia. So welcome, Merrick. For those who don't know, VV, we're a global team that helps institutions and individuals worldwide understand, capture, measure, and report their impact. So again, a bit of history. We know Cholderton since last year. We sponsored the inaugural Climate Challenge Cup, which celebrates exceptional climate-driven projects in the UK and the US. It took place at COP26 in Glasgow. You can see it here on our global collaboration platform, Track Impact, which is launched to align projects with the SDGs and encourage those kind of cross-sector international collaboration. So please do have a look at that. It's free to sign up to, and there's plenty of exciting projects there you can follow. And then just briefly, why we're here before I hand over to Merrick, you will be aware it's a very timely event. So just last week, the UN released its Sustainable Development Goals Report 2022, which isn't particularly pleasant reading because we're quite a way behind on the 17 goals. I will share this after the event. One of the key points in the report, it's one that's made often widely, is that the challenges faced by the world are interlinked and cascading. This is also very true of today's subject matter, sustainable farming. We've seen many different interlinking challenges lately, from record beating CO2 levels in the atmosphere through to major food supply chain challenges, heat waves, war, and all kinds of things that kind of come together. So fortunately, there is a lot of work happening towards sustainable farming. And on that note, I will hand over to Merrick, who will take us through.
Well, hello, everybody. Very nice meeting you in this way. My name is Merrick Thompson. I've worked in the public sector in environmental issues now, really all my working life, at all levels of government and also at all levels of the voluntary sector. I'm going to be talking mainly about an estate which I've helped develop an example of best practice of secure, sustainably produced food. This is part of the government's replacement strategy to the Common Agricultural Policy of the EU. Now that we've left, of course, that's got to be replaced. And DEFRA are very committed, actually, to a bottom-up approach so that the interventions, particularly the supporting interventions from the public sector, are defined really by the farming industry itself. That, by the way, has left the farming industry rather frustrated because those that are not involved in the project are feeling very vulnerable because they can see no clarity yet. But inevitably, a bottom-up approach to the design of systems does take time. It's worthwhile just spending a couple of minutes really on the legacy of the CAP. Forgive me just for running through those quick points. I first came into this topic just around 1980 when I was involved in delivering public money into the UK landscape, helping farmers replace and put back features of the countryside that they had actually taken out with EU funding. And that made me incensed that such a waste of public money was happening at that time. Very shortly after that, the EU, and you will remember this, the Grain Mountains, started to guarantee prices and guarantee the market for products. That immediately took the risk out of farming. And of course, that meant that the big institutions, the insurance companies, started to buy land because of that loss of risk. And that had a very big impact upon land prices, which frankly have not bottomed out to this day. The other impact, we lost mixed farming almost overnight in the part of the country that I know, in southern England. And the image that you see behind the text here is a place where I lived actually for 40 years, but it's a classic example where the farmer in question sold all the properties with 5 acres for £1 million, and reverted, taking out all the hedges, and then reverted to a totally unsustainable farming system. And I witnessed the loss of biodiversity over that 40 years. And really the implications for the landscape was very poor indeed. One of the main unintended consequences was the loss of soil health, not just the soil itself, but the health of the residual soil. And it was Cranfield, actually, University, who undertook quite a big survey of UK farmland and came to the conclusions that 80% of the soils were dead. That wasn't publicly announced, but it was a matter of fact. Professor Jim Harris actually told me that story. The unintended consequences are too numerous to give you over this presentation, but let's just look at the issue of nitrates. This land on this slide, by the way, is relatively infertile, chalk soils, very easy to work in all climates or weather patterns, very responsive to manipulation. And currently, it's a farm that is sprayed with nitrates every year. Those nitrates have a number of unintended consequences. One of those on the chalk soils, we are now importing water to dilute the drinking water. It's so serious, the content of the aquifers of nitrates. And if we switch off the nitrate tap today, we're locked into 40 years of groundwater pollution. Some of you may have seen in the press recently the issues of algae blooms across the intertidal zones of Poole Harbour, of Southampton Water, and the rest of the south coast. And those are algae blooms generated by nitrates. But perhaps the big one for today is the issue of nitrous oxide emissions, because soluble nitrates, as soon as they hit the ground, they start giving off nitrous oxide as a gas into the aquifers, and then out into the chalk streams, the chalk rivers, out into the estuaries and into the sea. And they continue to give off nitrous oxide. Despite the promises of precision farming, that still remains the case, that a huge quantity of nitrates is actually lost to the farming system. Now, nitrous oxide is something like 300 times more powerful a climate change gas than carbon dioxide is. And if you look at the statistics, the DEFRA statistics, of the amount of nitrates used, for example, 2 or 3 years ago, and I'm sure that's the case, that hasn't changed today, apart from that, the fact that nitrates are very, very expensive now, almost doubled in price. You will see, and you can work out the calculations yourself, that the emissions of carbon dioxide equivalent is something like 100 million tons per year. Now, that is 1/5 of all declared UK emissions, declared emissions. I emphasize that point. So we really do have a very, very serious issue with applied nitrates, despite what others will say about the importance of it. We believe, I say we, there's a strong movement now that I hope that you will have detected, that there are other ways of taking nitrogen out of the system. And I'll come back to that shortly. But the real issue again about the unintended consequences is the issue about the extinction and the destruction of our ecosystems, the very health of the landscape, not just about the loss of the seductive species of feather and fur, or the invertebrates, but also, of course, the destruction of the microbial content of our soils, especially the fungi implications. And let me be slightly provocative. It's actually science that has destroyed the biodiversity of our country. It is science that has caused the pollution of our aquifers and our seas. It may well be our science that will recover the situation, but I am one of the skeptics about the science that we've currently diverted and utilized. The other point to make is that because of the disallowance issues, this is where the UK would have handed out money to farmers, but there was a famous occasion when the government inherited a £800 million disallowance by Europe because of some administrative error. And that, of course, put the accountants in control and the Treasury in control. And I'm afraid it is fair to say that a very large proportion of farmers and land managers were put off exploring new and sustainable systems that were being supported through financial support through the various environmental schemes that were available. So we've basically treated farmers as potential fraudsters. We've got to have a different relationship with the industry. So not only technically have we got to transform our systems of land management, but we've also got to begin to have a cultural shift in the way that the private sector farmers relate to the public sector. And that means changes on all sides. Okay, next image, please. So we're now driven really by the 25-year environment plan that is the corporate plan. And I say corporate because it doesn't just refer to the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. It is a corporate plan of government. So the 25-year environment plan, which I contributed to the development of that in a tiny way, not in a big way. And the government have then announced that they will introduce this new environmental land management system, which will come into force in 2024. And there are three basic components to the ELMS project, that's Environmental Land Management project. Sustainable farming incentives, and that's now been launched, nature recovery and landscape recovery. So those are the three essential components. And their design is being undertaken today. So we do not have a clear articulation of what those policies are going to be and what the values are going to be attributed in terms of incentives to pursue more sustainable systems. So it's a bit of a watch this space. There's plenty of links now on the DEFRA site, so you can catch up with the latest system. But we've got to look at the outcomes. And there is a list really of the outcomes from a more sustainable approach to land management. Some of you will know about Dieter Helm and his natural capital account. And I will refer back to this point in a minute, but he basically says we've got to give a value, even though it's very, very difficult to do, to the elements of life. That's my definition of natural capital, the things that sustain life: clean air, clean water, restored health of soils, and the biodiversity, the biological health of the landscape. And at the same time, the terrible urgent need now to build resilience into our landscapes to survive the unknown events that are going to happen as a result of climate change. And I think there was a principal point here where 3 years ago, I think we would have had great difficulty for the public to understand this point. And indeed, we certainly had objections from the farming industry, who really wanted to be left alone and believed totally in the free market. And certainly a strong right-wing conservative government would not want to see public intervention into private business. But I believe the climate is right now for the public to understand and welcome and push and demand for this statement about secure, sustainably produced food being a public good. And that for me is a very important point that we could perhaps debate later. Obviously, the point about restored habitats and improving biodiversity and building resilience is incredibly important. The mechanical methods of storing carbon have not really risen to the challenge, I believe. And I believe that land management, actually, if we get that right, we can really transform the issues of carbon and carbon capture, and to behave in a way on land management that is and must remain climate positive. And I talk about restored variations in landscape character, and there's a fundamental science base to that, in that the landscape character of our great country, which is so diverse, reflects the variations in soil and geology and microclimate and in ecosystems. And once you get the loss of those, then you get interventions that are causing massive social and long-term economic problems. We mustn't forget the historic environment. The landscape we've inherited today are thousands and thousands of years of human intervention and a record of that intervention. And then the new and critical issue really is that we've now a very heavily populated island. 80% of us live in towns and cities. And certainly the pandemic has shown us how important accessing green space is. And I believe that we must modernize our access to rural areas for the health and well-being of the nation. Well, that's a huge topic, and we can perhaps discuss that later. Next image, please. So just a few observations. This is really designed to prod you into participating in the debate. So I make the point about natural capital accounting being a game changer. It is absolutely a game changer, because we're now beginning to account for those unaccounted for, unintended consequences of intensive farming systems. And we are in crisis. Let's undermine that point. We are in crisis in terms of water quality, in terms of climate change, and in terms of extinction. And so I believe that giving a value to things that we've never valued before is essential if you actually believe in the market economy. This does present a question for government, really. What are you going to do? We've had a failed regulatory system, let's be frank about it. If we've had a proper regulatory system at all, when you look at the state of our rivers as an example. So are we actually going to accept that farmers will pursue the money and we enter into a different relationship with the farming industry and build a collaborative, cooperative approach to sustainable land management? Or are we going to, and therefore invest properly, or are we going to revert back to regulation? And that's going to be a political dilemma that I can see will unravel over the next 10 years or so. The investment into agriculture is about 3.5 billion, and the government are planning to reduce that, although they've given a commitment in the life of this government to sustaining that investment. But the point I would make is, if you are planning to reduce that investment, that doesn't really read well when you are now making a whole new demands for multifunctional outcomes from land management. So there's a big dilemma. But maybe if we are really going to drive up the health and well-being of this nation, maybe we'll see budget investments coming from the health side of society's interventions. One of the big questions is this business about the emerging markets, about net gain in terms of biodiversity and development, and the issues around the emerging carbon market. I'm not convinced, because of course it just allows a continuation of unsustainable behavior, unsustainable development. Surely that's what we should be tackling. And I think there's all sorts of potential problems that have not yet been resolved. So there's a huge piece of research for university interests. Next image then, please. So the Cholderton estate is the estate that I suggested to the government they ought to look at as a model of best practice for mixed farms on chalk soils. And I make that point very specifically because there is a danger that we think that a national policy can be crafted that will take on all aspects of the variations in our landscape, and that is just not the case. The chalk soils, issues of chalk soils in southern England is completely different from the other soil types. And the solutions and the policies and the intervention mechanisms must reflect the landscapes that we are dealing with. So very quickly, Cholderton Estate is a farm inherited by Henry Edmonds in about 1976. He had to sell off a lot of the land for death duties, which was a shame, but he's left with 1,000 hectares of mixed farming. He has one dairy herd, a beef herd, sheep, and undertakes arable primarily to put back into his animals in rotation. It's a 10-year rotation, 4 years in arable and 6 years in grazing. He has 200 hectares of that 1,000 hectares is not ploughed at all, is not in rotation, primarily because it's steep land and the dangers of soil erosion are too severe. So it's in permanent pasture. But I can say, and I've been in this business for quite some years now, that I know of no other farm that you can go to that completely proves that the food he produces will stand up to great scrutiny in terms of the disciplines around sustainability. Fantastic statement there about the biological richness, because Plant Life and the Wildlife Trust, Plant Life, by the way, particularly on the issue of arable weeds, but the Wildlife Trust in terms of all animal and plant species, have determined that Cholderton is the richest, if not one of the richest commercial estates producing great food for its biodiversity in the country. And just to give you an example, some of you will know all this, there are 23 species of British bumblebee in this country. He has 18 different species of British bumblebee on his estate. And if you want to see more information about the biological content, I have all the supporting reports for that. Quite uniquely, the estate also, because of his shallow plough strategy and his rotation and his commitment to diversity in herb content, and that's not just diversity in species, but diversity in behavior. So I made the point about sandfoin and deep rooting. This is an example of where the plants he selected, instinctively selected, have really driven up his resilience. Some of you will be experiencing very hot weather at the moment. And I was just telling Alex earlier that 3 years ago, Southern England had a very real problem with failing grazing because of the drought conditions. Farmers then around him were having to use their hay that they'd stored for the winter to graze their animals in the middle of the summer. Well, Henry had no problems like that at all, specifically because of sandfoin, which deep rooting and was drawing moisture up from the chalk. And his grazing fields were beautifully resilient, and he had no problems with grazing at all through drought. So that point about resilience is going to be one of the fundamental outcomes that we now need to build into our farming systems. But all of that leads to a very interesting statistic on sequestration. I quote that figure: 128 tons of carbon in soils per hectare, and that's double anything else we found on neighboring farms farming the same soils. So that's incredibly important. Of course, we can sequestrate through forests and hedges, but we must also be attuned to the fact that our soils, and there are multi-purpose reasons why our soils should be full of carbon, not only in terms of the sequestration of it, but the water holding capacity, the whole issue of nutrient release, the whole issue of microbial health and microbial activity. And that's where I believe the future research is going to have to spend considerable resources looking at. We did a natural capital account of the estate, and we looked 60 years forward, and there we valued the food, that's the net value of food production, at 5.4 million over the next 60 years, compared to the public goods value, and that's net value, at 125 million over the same period. So what do I mean by net value? That 125, by the way, is net of numerous figures, but one of those figures, £5 million, which is given to the value of methane emissions from the cattle. So we can put our hand on our heart and say that 125 million is very accurate. In fact, 100 million of that is a value given to the wildlife content of the estate, and that's based on DEFRA's figures, and it is absolutely the minimum, because DEFRA's figures do not go anything like the ability to record the diversity of species that this landscape is naturally blessed with. So that is a minimum, the 100 million that you see in that figure. And the issue about emerging markets, carbon, for example, we must make certain that all farms are climate positive before they start selling their surplus carbon assets. So that's a really important point that I would urge every farmer looking at the emerging markets to be very careful to adhere to. And of course, the Cholderton estate produces clean water. It needs to. It happens to run one of the smallest private water companies in the country, servicing 2,000 people. And it is essential that the water he produces from his aquifer is clean. But you can imagine the problem, 100 meters below ground, diffuse pollution migrating from neighboring estates is actually causing real problems with his aquifer. And indeed, that water company is one of the water companies having to import water from time to time to dilute the nitrate. It's called blending, to dilute the nitrate content. Clean air, well, he is basically extracting nitrogen from the air, fixing nitrogen using plants like sandfoin to fix and slow release into the soils. Cranfield University did some research on Cholderton soils and were very, very impressed with the microbial health and the health of his soils and the way he was managing the soils. So that is a critical outcome. There is actually a film you can access, and we'll give you the link to that. We made about Cholderton, and that will give you a different version. I'm giving you one. You'll get another one on that from that film, but it's really worth watching if you have 25 minutes. Okay, next image, please. So I have a number of reports, and I'm not going to spend any time on this. There is my email address, mhdt@btinternet.com. If you would like to have any of these technical reports, I'm very happy to share them with you. They are publicly funded by DEFRA as part of the tests and trials, and therefore these reports must be made available freely to anybody who wants them. So I'm very happy to share those with any of the viewers participating in this webinar today. Next image then, and this is my final point really. What is then the future of food and farming in light of these new tensions? And Alex very well articulated the context in his early presentation of this extraordinary place we find ourselves in terms of huge populations, a small island, failing world crops because of climate change or Putin's behavior. We really are in a corner, and we really do need now to give greater emphasis to the sustainability of land management. All of our systems in this country are all about controlling development. But I'm afraid I feel very passionate that actually it's not development of our land that has caused the demise of our ecosystems. It is the way we've chosen to manage our land that has caused the extinction of species and the terrible state of our biodiversity. We've got to look at food waste inevitably. That is a driver of many of our problems. And we've got to look at nutrition, we've got to look at diet, and we've got to look at taste. So much of our food is tasteless. These are big issues, and you can't look at land management without undertaking a radical review of those topics. And I feel passionate, and I'm sure you do as well, about terminating food imports from unsustainable systems, where we are drawing water out of parts of the world that desperately need more water than we do. And we are polluting through our purchasing powers vast areas internationally. Well, we should be ashamed of ourselves. And in a democracy, we've really got to force the government to take a different attitude to supporting unsustainable systems. I'm absolutely certain we're going to see a great growth in vertical farming, in urban fringes, in industrial estates, very close to consumers, where all these unintended consequences can be absolutely controlled, provided, of course, we can adhere to the standards of diet and taste and nutrients that and nutritious food that we desperately need. So I've talked about this before. Of course, we've got to research into the optimum microbial health of soils. And Cranfield made this point very, very much, that depending on your soil type, depending on your business production, the optimum microbial content of soils will vary. But this is really where I believe the research needs to go. We talk about organic farming being a system of yesterday. Actually, it's not. It is basically harnessing the power of natural systems rather than suppressing the power of natural systems. That's the new science. And that's where the research must go. The microbial content of our soils, and you will all know this, far exceed the biological diversity of our seas and of above our soil levels. We've got to modernize the governance, this point about collaboration between the public and private and voluntary sectors. And we've got to have a new consortium, because this is not a political issue, actually. This is the future of humanity we're talking about. And the models that we set here, we can actually demonstrate best practice to the rest of the world. Although I have to say, there's some real movement in France, which is very promising. So we're not alone now at realizing that the last 45 years have not been brilliant in terms of sustainable food production. So we've also got to be more accountable locally, bearing in mind 80% of us live in towns and cities, bearing in mind our policies are driven by democracy. It is essential that we reconnect the town with country. And we've got to be very place sensitive in our policies. Some of you won't know the map on the left, but this is the national character map of the UK, 159 different characters. And they are basically a record of how human intervention on natural systems, on soils, on microclimates, on ecosystems, on topography, on geology. This is a map of the interaction. Basically, this is a map of farming-determined landscapes. And we really ought to be articulating the agenda at a joined up way. As you well know, I'm afraid in terms of delivery, government do work in silos. So look at the DEFRA family. You've got Forestry Commission, Environment Agency, Natural England, you've got Rural Payments Agency, all have their own business plans. And yet there's only one farmer very often behind the farm gate, having to struggle with a myriad, and that's just one department. What about local government? They have statutory obligations on land management, rights of way, food standards, animal well-being. So it is very important that we articulate the agenda at a scale that the farming industry can understand. So communications is incredibly important. I have undertaken another test and trial for DEFRA, and I have a report that's not mentioned here at all on the new governance that I am recommending to the government in terms of how to administer this process. You've been extremely patient. I've covered an awful lot of ground. I hope I've stimulated some interest and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Mary. That was fascinating. So if anybody has any questions, now's the time. Please do ask. I see we've got one in the chat, which is says, "Thank you for sharing the report. Are the baseline figures of the natural capital audit local or national or EU benchmarks?"
They are based upon the, as I mentioned, national guidance in terms of DEFRA's figures, because we have to use national statistics that are transferable all over the country. So that's the answer to that. But obviously, they are based upon the very specific characteristics of that particular estate. of the Cholderton estate.
Okay, great. Are there any more questions? Appreciate that we've run slightly over, but we are still available to answer anything.
I've got a question, Merrick, if I may. Well, what are the main sort of blockers or hurdles that other mixed chalk soil farms need to overcome to follow the Cholderton estate model? You know, are there a couple of key issues stopping them from following suit?
Yes. So I want to just comment on your first preamble there. I did mention that on the chalk soils, we lost mixed farming almost overnight. So there's a very, very small number of mixed farms left on the chalk. Of those, inevitably, one of the blockages is the uncertainty at this time of what the intervention supporting funding will be from DEFRA. So that's an uncertainty. We have to acknowledge that Henry has operated instinctively, but he has a very, very good science knowledge. And so it's quite important that we provide the support, the technical support. And I think the other point to make is that changing a business plan in the middle of such uncertainty is high risk. And I think that I can confidently say that DEFRA realizes that we've got to have a period of transition, perhaps as much as 10 years of transition, helping the industry move from adopting unsustainable to a much more sustainable system.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, well, we have another question from Stephen. So would one of the blockages be knowledge? It maybe is a large step to take to move from intensive farming focused on monoculture to Henry's mixed organic farming.
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree with that statement. We do need to have digestible, science-based advice and help for the industry. And communicating that is a trick, really. How best do farmers take in information and how best to communicate with them? What is the support? And that's part of the test and trial, by the way, is to identify how best to equip the industry to move to being much more sustainable. There is a quite a big problem with having lost all of our mixed farming from chalk soil. So a lot of the problems are more to do with intensive arable, where we have lost the skills of animal husbandry, we've lost the infrastructure of water, of fences, of buildings. And I made this point, by the way, when I was interviewed by Michael Gove at the start of the 25-year environment plan. I made the point that he is going to have a capital element to the new scheme to enable the industry to restructure itself to increase the amount of mixed farms on chalk soils. Now, there is an issue here where big arable farmers will not want to go back to keeping animals. But I suspect that we need to see greater collaboration from people who are wanting to enter the industry, but don't have the resources to buy the land, but perhaps could enter into some sort of partnership where peripatetic herds, flocks of animals can indeed provide that animal content to the sustainable package. So we may have to look at different farming systems. And I believe there's an awful lot of good practice going on, investigations going on in this area. And I do want to make that point, by the way, that there are, Cholderton is outstanding, but there are many, many other farms now that are moving in this direction. And I think that you must take heart from programs like Country Files suddenly profiling regenerative farming as the way forward, and that's really good news. I think that a shift has happened. Let's now sustain it with proper science behind the policies.
Great, thank you. We have one more question. Do you see regulation or incentives, carrot or the stick, being the best way to move towards more sustainable farming?
I think if we have to revert to regulation, it's an indication of failure of communication, because as I said, I believe that the issues of climate change, of water quality, these are facts. And I think the farming industry is wise, and they will totally understand that the impacts, the adverse impacts, the unintended consequences of the impacts of their systems are now very, very damaging. And so I would like to think that we should not pursue regulation, because it is very expensive, it's very intrusive. And as I said to you, it's a recognition of failure of communication. I believe the answer lies in collaboration, and I believe that it is right to keep food prices affordable by supporting financially the farming industry in its move to sustainability. I do not support a penny of public money incentives going to support unsustainable systems. Of course, we must account for the issue about transition. So a 10-year transition plan, as long as we can guarantee that the outcomes at the end of the 10 years, I believe that that's our public investment strategy should account for that. So I'm a supporter of investment, of public investment, collaborating with the industry.
Okay, great. Thank you, Merrick. I don't see any more questions. So if there are any, we will follow up with some information after the session. So you'll have Merrick's email, of course. Do please feel free to get in touch. Other than that, I'm going to close the session down, so we'll stop sharing now. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Merrick, for presenting. And thank you everyone for your questions as well.